Well, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you to those of you who are here with us and to the 100 or so online folks who are joining us virtually. I'm Annelise Riles. I'm the Executive Director of the Roberta Buffett Institute for Global Affairs here at Northwestern. The Buffett Institute's mission is to cross boundaries of all kinds and bring folks together across disciplines and professions to address our greatest global challenges. And this series, our Fireside Chat series, is really about bringing leaders in global affairs, working on really important cutting-edge problems to enlighten us about pressing global issues. And so today I'm thrilled to have with us Ambassador Steven McGann. Ambassador McGann is former U.S. Ambassador to Fiji, Nauru, Kiribati, Tonga, and Tuvalu. And he also served as Chief of Mission of the U.S. Embassy in Dili, Timor-Leste. So a very, very, very knowledgeable diplomat about the Pacific, and wonderful to have that voice with us today. Ambassador McGann is also the founder of the Stevenson Group, which is a consulting firm based in Washington, D.C. So we will reserve some time for questions, both from folks here in the room and everyone online. So if you're online, please put your questions in the chat box at the bottom of the Zoom, and we will get to as many of those as we can. This is such a rare opportunity to sort of dig in on Pacific issues that we're really going to geek out a little bit and go into the details, but I want to mention that we're also going to do a podcast with Ambassador McGann later today. And so if you have friends and colleagues who you think would like to hear a little bit more, perhaps a slightly lighter and shorter version of the conversation, we will have that available on our Breaking Boundaries podcast as well. Okay, so let's dig in. So first of all, welcome. Thank you for being here. Tell us a little bit about you. How did you end up in the Pacific? And how did you become a diplomat?
Well, those are two separate questions. Yes. All right. When I graduated from undergraduate school, Claremont Men's College, Claremont McKenna College today, I always felt that the Foreign Service would be a good option. I had a long-standing interest in international affairs, but I wasn't quite ready to join the Foreign Service. I thought I actually was going to teach, right? And I went on to graduate school, but I was swayed by the Department of State to join the Foreign Service. But I have to say that your career only makes sense looking backwards, not looking forwards. So while I always endorse the notion of self-authorship, right? That I really wanted to be a Foreign Service officer. Serendipity plays a really big role in how your career advances. And I had no idea that when I joined the Foreign Service, that my very first assignment in 1979 would be to the American Institute in Taiwan. It was at the same time in which we de-recognized the government in Taipei and recognized the government in Beijing. I'm not going to insist I'm a China expert, but however, being in Taiwan at that time, it was the beginnings of the Taiwan independence movement. And the Taiwan independence movement sent a signal, not just to the Chinese Communist Party, but the Kuomintang Party, right, that there was going to be a new force, a new element in Taiwan, which would begin to shape international affairs in the Pacific later on going forward. So from that point on, I probably spent about a third of my career in the region, in various jobs. I worked on environment issues and the first United Nations Conference on Environment and Development in Rio. And specifically to the Pacific, I worked on the General Assembly resolution that banned drift net fishing. That's called the banning of large-scale pelagic drift net fishing. I have to add that it was the second operational resolution of the United Nations General Assembly. The first one was on the question of Palestine. Ralph Bunche got a Nobel Peace Prize. I did not get a Nobel Peace Prize for banning drift net fishing. But it then led to assignments in Australia. And then I also served in the Bureau of Refugees, Migration, and Population, dealing with Asian Near East issues. So it all started coming together until later on I was asked to be the director for Australia, New Zealand, Pacific affairs, and then on to Suva. That's sort of the short version.
Really interesting, and interesting how it all comes together. We'll get to fishing in a minute,
Okay.
because I think you deserve a prize for that. But, so one of the, you mentioned serendipity, and we had planned you coming before we knew that just last week there would be this very important event, which is the Biden administration hosting the first ever U.S. Pacific Island Summit with leaders of Pacific Island nations from across the region. There was an important declaration that came out of that on climate change and regional security. Can you tell us a little bit about the context of this, the significance of this summit, and what you think is behind it from a geopolitical point of view?
Well, I think as early as 2007, we became aware of the fact that there was going to be greater and greater competition with China in the region. The Chinese were bringing a great deal of resources to bear, particularly on development issues. And in 2007, we actually, in conjunction with the East-West Center, had a meeting of the Pacific Island Conference of Leaders in Washington. It was not a White House meeting. And as you can well imagine, our disappointment, because we pointed out that 5 presidents had served in the Pacific: Kennedy, Nixon, Ford, Bush, Ronald Reagan made movies about the Pacific. So there was awareness. But I think part of the problem for the U.S. was that we took, not that we took the Pacific for granted, but we always thought that the status quo would remain, and didn't understand what the nature of Chinese competition in the region would be. Now, mind you, the Chinese had no idea that the Belt Road Initiative was going to end in Nuku'alofa. All right, that wasn't the point. The point still goes back to the competition for diplomatic recognition with Taiwan, and that was the first, I think, spurring of Chinese interests in the region. Then the Chinese started saying, "Oh, wait a minute, there are UN votes here. There are other areas that we can build alliances with," and then also we have to move away from the strategic interests of China, the United States, the big regional partners, to the very particular human security concerns of the people of the region. And the Chinese were able to address those issues much faster. The meeting that we just recently had in Washington, I think, was a first attempt to understand that U.S. national security concerns have to meet the human security concerns of the people of the region. So that meeting 2 weeks ago was hopefully a starting point of a new dialogue with Pacific leaders, not a return to business as usual where we build a few climate change resilient houses and then walk away. I think there has to be a real commitment to the region.
Interesting. Okay, so you said so many interesting things there. I want to parse it out a little bit. So you talked about national security concerns meeting human security concerns. Let's take both sides of that equation. First, national security. What are U.S. national security interests, and what is on the security strategic military side, what is the thinking about the future for the U.S. in the region?
I think from a national security standpoint, we start looking at engagement with China in the South China Sea. We are looking, of course, at the potential conflict across the Taiwan Straits. Then at the same time, in order to support deployments in the region, we need friendly facilities, bases in the rest of the Pacific. So they kind of converge. All right? You can't have an aircraft carrier in the middle of the Pacific without the aircraft carrier have someplace to go. All right? And so what was launched just recently, 2 years ago, was called the Pacific Deterrence Initiative, in which essentially the United States, primarily the Department of Defense, through U.S. Indo-PACOM, is looking at how do we deploy the region, what facilities do we have to build to support those deployments, and most importantly, what do we have to do vis-a-vis getting support from host countries? How do we build sufficient partnerships when they have, as I mentioned, particularly human security concerns, economic development, healthcare infrastructure, um, fisheries protection, all of these other issues come together. And so we have to sort out how to make all of this work and not just, again, focus on the possibility of a conflict, but in fact, how does the Pacific remain Pacific? How does it remain still a peacetime entity?
Interesting. Interesting. So can you say more about those human security concerns? What are they? What are you hearing from the region about what are those primary concerns, and what is it that they're hoping that the rest of the world can contribute around those issues?
Well, I think the first thing you have to look at is how rigid the economies of the Pacific are. If you're not fortunate enough to have a tourism base, then you're sort of resorting to working for the government. There's a small commercial sector, but there's actually no way to engage in the global economy. All right, so that's the first thing. Secondly, I think that when we look at Pacific Island countries, I mentioned healthcare infrastructure, for example, which became obvious during COVID. We have to deal with other issues: gender-based violence, protection of vulnerable populations, law enforcement cooperation. There's just a number of issues that have to be addressed that we really aren't focusing on. There's this notion that poverty in paradise is great. No, it isn't. It's not really great at all. So just because we want to go to the beach doesn't mean if you live at the beach, it's a great thing. All right. And so those concerns of Pacific Island countries have to be met. Electrification is an example. Also, another point, because of the relatively low employment opportunities, migration is an important issue that has to be addressed by Pacific Island countries. And if we're talking about migration, what we're really talking about is labor remittances. About a third of the GDP of Pacific Island countries is based on labor remittances. So Pacific Island peoples are interested in not just going to pick fruit, right? They need an educational system that will give them sustainable jobs so that when they move to these other countries, that they can support their families back home. Perfect example, Tonga, right? We had the recent volcano in Tonga. Everyone is quite aware of that. But what people weren't aware that 80% of the monthly income of Tongolese comes from Tongans overseas. And most of them are actually in the United States, right? So what's important to us is different than what's important to Pacific peoples. And so that's those types of human security concerns we have to address.
Really interesting and so well said. So I think that a lot of people in the United States suddenly have the Pacific on their radar because of the UN climate conferences and the leadership of Pacific Island countries at the UN, the Blue Pacific Initiative, and so on. For those who are not aware, could you share a little bit about how the environmental crisis that we're in now is impacting Pacific Island countries and what it is that they are calling for, either at this latest conference or more generally, from the rest of the world around climate?
Well, first of all, obviously, many it's not just Pacific countries, so small island developing countries see climate change as an existential threat, primarily due to sea level rise. And it's not so much that these islands are going to sink beneath the waves right away, but actually what's going to happen is that the water table on these islands is going to disappear, so there'll be no fresh water, they won't be inhabitable. I think that for smaller islands like Tuvalu, Kiribati, the Maldives, those are really, really critical issues. For the larger islands, there's still room for adaptability, and in very many ways, climate change may not be an existential threat per se, but it does bring focus on what are the development needs in terms of climate change resiliency. And the most important part of that is, for instance, the frequency and ferocity of cyclones now in the region. Right? Just as we see in Florida, Hurricane Ian, we're seeing more and more damaging cyclones in the Pacific, which are tearing up infrastructure. So there are a number of issues beyond the sinking of islands below the waves, But that also does address if Pacific Island countries' uh, populations have to move, who controls their exclusive economic zones? The seventh largest exclusive economic zone in the world belongs to Kiribati. Kiribati extends from almost from Hawaii to Guam. If Tarawa disappears beneath the waves, what happens to the people of Kiribati? We do know there's some other um, plans in stock, but what's really important to them, who controls their EEZ? If you're forced to leave your country because of climate change, um, who has the fishing rights to the EEZ? Who controls that security corridor? These are questions that have to be addressed. How do you preserve the culture? Now, mind you, Kiribati, most people aren't aware, has the world's largest marine conservation preserve with the United States. All right, but even with that, marine conservation does not address the existential threat of climate change.
So let's talk about fisheries. So what are the key issues now around fisheries, around fishing, and what you talked about netting? What opportunities are there for Pacific Islanders in terms of economic development, and what are the challenges on the environmental side?
Well, let's be clear. Pacific Island peoples don't overfish. All right, okay? So we're not worried about Pacific Island peoples using up all the tuna stocks. We are worried about illegal, unregulated fishing by larger countries, particularly not just China, Japan, but a number of Southeast Asian countries. Indonesia has a large fleet, for example. But the unregulated fishing and the depopulation of fishing stocks goes directly to the economic viability of Pacific Island countries because marine licenses have to be purchased. You have to have secure zones to monitor fishing. As a matter of fact, one of the good things that the United States actually did do was it embarked upon signing a series of what we call shipwriter agreements with Pacific Island countries. We have a total of 12 now. And what that allows you to do is to take a maritime law enforcement officer from a Pacific Island country and have them on board a U.S. Coast Guard vessel. And you can patrol the region and you can stop suspicious fishing. And as a matter of fact, it's a fairly successful program because the deterrence isn't so much that this Coast Guard cutter is going to fire and sink you. The deterrence is if you're caught, it's the $5 million fine a day. All right, so that program seems to work, and as it is a sizable source of income for Pacific Island countries. Yeah, United States alone has dedicated over the next 10 years $600 million for fisheries protection. All right, and so when we think of fisheries protection, that's what we're really focusing on, not depleting stocks of tuna. We also have to be aware that there's also an onshore-offshore part to fisheries protection, and that many of the jobs that women of the Pacific have are related to fishing. All right, reselling fish on shore and things of that nature. So it's just not looking for these trawlers that have turned off their transponders, but really is a focus on how do we maintain the economic viability of the region writ large.
So I want to ask you about the Solomon Islands because they have signed this security agreement with China now, and I understand that there was some discussion at the summit about whether or not they would sign. In the end, they did sign. But what is the U.S. strategy in terms of engaging the Solomon Islands going forward, and how do we manage this kind of seems like quite direct security competition with China?
Okay. Well, the situation in the Solomon Islands is a bit more complex than people are regarding it. Yes, it's easy to see the competition again between China and the United States, and that somehow the Chinese are looking at the Solomons as a potential site for a base, and how this could interrupt shipping between the Pacific and Australia, and all these big strategic issues. But there's another part to that that people are focusing on. First of all, these Solomon Islands has always been friendly toward the United States. There's never been a situation in which the Solomons did not welcome a U.S. ship visit, for example. But the prime minister of the Solomon Islands is extremely nationalistic. He has, throughout his career, and he's been prime minister of Solomon Islands 4 times now, has been very resistant to the notion that Australia could essentially impose its will on Pacific Island countries, right? And this, and you may recall in the early 2000s, the Australians had what was called the Regional Assistance Mission, Ramsey, to the Solomon Islands. He couldn't stand that mission. And as a matter of fact, here's a Taiwan story. I was sent as director to Taipei to talk about the Taiwanese support, financial support to politicians in Solomon Islands. At that time, the Prime Minister Sogavare was receiving money from Taiwan. And the concern was he was using those funds to disrupt some of the activities of the Ramsey mission. You come full circle, and that same prime minister is now receiving funds from China to support his political purposes. But more importantly, I think that he really signed that security agreement to poke a thumb in the eye of the Australians, not necessarily because he's antithetical to U.S. interests. As I said, it's very complicated. But the real point is, when do we start looking at the Pacific through the lens of Pacific peoples as opposed through our own strategic interests?
That's really interesting and important. So let me ask you about some of those complexities. So there is this history of colonialism in the region, Australia, New Zealand, US, France, the United Kingdom. Some of that is still alive when you think of French New Caledonia and so on. Certainly the Australian sort of role in the region remains strong. And on the other side, there seems to be some tension between Pacific Island countries now. They don't all speak with one voice, and we've seen that, the Polynesians, the Melanesians, the Micronesians, and so forth. Can you give us your analysis of what it is that policymakers need to know when you talk about seeing this through the lens of Pacific Islanders? What would you emphasize that's important to understand? What are the complexities, and how do we manage those?
Yeah. I think, first of all, it goes beyond just talking to Pacific peoples and their leaders, but also, you mentioned colonialism. The Pacific is a relatively new colonial-free region. Most people forget that even prior to World War I, Germany had colonies in the Pacific. That the United States, when it gave independence, or rather ended the trust territory ship relationship with what's now the freely associated states, that's a recent occurrence. Fiji, just in 1979, became an independent country, no longer a British protectorate. Same for Kiribati. But I think what we have to do is really start parsing out the Pacific a little bit more. There is not a crisis, but the situation in Melanesia deserves special attention. We all know about Papua New Guinea, right? Papua New Guinea is a country of 10 million people. It's rife with its own problems, but there's Papua New Guinea trying to continue to develop itself as a sustainable democracy. The independence of Bougainville comes to mind. We've seen fractions within the Solomons, the differences between the people in Guadalcanal and the people of Malita Island. New Caledonia is also an interesting situation where the ethnic Canuck people have been seeking independence from France for close to 15 years now. Many of you may know New Caledonia only because you saw McHale's Navy as a kid, and they were always going to New Caledonia, but just as an aside. But New Caledonia also is one of the world's largest suppliers of nickel. And you need nickel for lithium batteries. So suddenly, there's a new strategic interest in the status of New Caledonia. In the last referendum, 47% of the ethnic New Caledonians did not vote in the referendum. So I think that you'll find France may be a bit reluctant to have it going forward, but just the complexities of the region. Situation in West Papua in Indonesia. So Melanesia has its own particular problems that have to be addressed in the context of Melanesia. The North Pacific, I think, is a bit more manageable in the sense that it's rigid. We have the relationship with the freely associated states and Kiribati as an example. Polynesia, there has been a great deal of affinity between Polynesia and New Zealand. Samoa was once a protectorate of New Zealand. The Cooks still are. So when you look at the differences between Micronesia, Melanesia, and Polynesia, you have to parse those out a bit. I would say that Polynesia is probably the most stable of it, notwithstanding there are people in Tahiti who want to be independent, but I have a funny feeling that's not going to happen anytime soon. But again, just understanding that there are differences in approach, attitudes, and notions of self-determinations that divide up the Pacific. So it's not just the colonial history, but it's also what are the aspirations of the peoples of the region based on the country in which you're in. And of course, there's Fiji, right?
Well, you mentioned the Kanaks, and as a graduate student, I was really brought into thinking about anti-nuclear issues through the lens of Kanak people's activism, because they've been very concerned about testing, nuclear testing, and obviously the US has conducted tests in the region as well. I'm wondering how you see this history of nuclear testing affecting the region, the great powers relationships of the region, and what are the Pacific Island nations leaders calling for in terms of addressing the history of those tests?
The nuclear issue is extremely complex. I think that as far as testing has been resolved. There's no more atmospheric testing. That's over. However, the issue of compensation is a separate issue. I think we'll hold that aside for a second. But so you have testing. Then you have the question of the peaceful uses of nuclear energy. Can we look at using small nuclear reactors for energy on larger Pacific islands? So you have the peaceful uses, you have the end of testing, and no matter what, there's still a question that there are nuclear weapons that are traversing the Pacific all the time. So understanding each of these in a different context is important. The nuclear issue as concerns the situation in Marshall Islands and the Bikini Island victims, that is very difficult. I had the opportunity to work on that issue when I was director. And the posture of the United States is that it's contributed close to $150 million toward the Bikini Island victims, and we're sort of done with that issue, which is very difficult if you're a Marshallese. And so this recent effort by Pacific Island countries to raise the nuclear issue in the Human Rights Council of the United Nations may be slightly off target. All right, it may not reveal the results that they want. However, that doesn't mean that we can't be creative in addressing these issues. I mean, just as an aside, the United States was also stingy with our own soldiers. We only gave a maximum of $75,000 to soldiers and sailors who were deployed in the region who contracted cancer as a result of nuclear testing. So we really don't have a good track record on that at all. even with our own people. But I do think that if we look at, say, for instance, the question of migration and the Marshall Islands, um, people don't realize that the largest city in the Marshall Islands is Springdale, Arkansas. It's not Majuro. It's not the capital.
I thought you were going to say Honolulu.
No,
There's a lot of
no,
Marshallese in
no.
Honolulu.
That's the largest city in Chuuk, which is an island in Micronesia. Right. But so maybe instead of focusing on compensation for the victims of Bikini Island, which is still a valid point, maybe we need to look at what type of resources are we putting into Marshall Islands. Can we give better education? Can we make sure that there is uniformity in the healthcare benefits that Americans receive onshore here in the United States, and Marshallese and other members of the freely associated states when they come and exercise their rights to work in the United States? You know, can we be creative? Can we build, you know, as I said, better educational facilities so that when people go offshore, they have real jobs. They're not just, again, plucking chickens in Springdale, Arkansas. I think that looking at, you know, improving healthcare infrastructure writ large in a region is something we can do, all right? But we don't have to call it compensation, all right? You know, let's just move the dialogue forward. I think for right now, we're stuck in this negotiation, which really shouldn't be a negotiation on the renewal of the Compacts for Free Association between, particularly between Marshall Islands and the United States over the nuclear issue, as opposed to let's focus on what's positive we can do. That's going to be very difficult to get to, but that's
Spoken like a seasoned diplomat. A great third way. Excellent. Well, let's open this up to questions from the group. Yes, please.
Hi, Trish Beddoes, Earth and Environmental Sciences. Hi, Trish Beddoes, Earth and Environmental Sciences. I want to focus on something that is present in the region that frankly holds probably the future of sustainability for the whole planet, which is the deep sea mineral deposits. So some people may know that the ocean bottom can accumulate nuggets, and some of them very large, some of them fairly small, some of them distributed through the sediments. Nautilus Minerals out of Australia some years ago was probably the leading enterprise to try and get deep sea mining off the ground. These aggregated minerals have a huge collection of the lower half of the periodic table. They're critical for all sustainable energy, turbines, batteries, et cetera. So more than just the nickel. What is the potential for these island nation states to leverage their deep ocean economic zone control in order to secure their future and the planet's future? Papua New Guinea their economic zone was the target for Nautilus Minerals, which interestingly enough, their stock prices are at zero right now. Mm-hmm. So what's the reality of deep ocean mining in the region?
Okay. That question actually goes back to the point I was making earlier about the importance of Melanesia. One of the things that we ought to consider when it comes to the question of deep seabed mining is that, yes, everything is in the Pacific, but it's also a long way down, all right? And so there are only certain island chains that have the ability to manage any form of deep seabed mining. Mind you, the United States did not sign the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea because of deep seabed mining issues, but that's another aside. I do think that we have to bear in mind that the Chinese are also very much interested, not just in the competition for diplomatic recognition, which I mentioned earlier, but yes, there is consideration of what about deep seabed mining and the benefits for China itself. The good news is that we're still a long way away from the technology. We know there's a lot of stuff 75 miles down. You still got to get there, right? And so I think this is where it becomes important to start focusing again. I mentioned earlier the EEZs of these countries. Right? What happens when the islands are depopulated? But who controls what's in their EEZ? We don't want these island countries to become free-for-alls for such mining activities only because their populations are no longer there. I do think that Papua New Guinea, we mentioned New Caledonia, Fiji, Vanuatu, Solomons are ripe for that type of exploration and exploitation. So I think we're going to have to move to a point where we're going to have to look at more established protocols for dealing with that. And so that it's an inevitability, but it has to be managed correctly. But I don't think you're going to stop it. What we don't want in the Pacific is the same situation as we have in Eastern Congo, as an example. All right, so.
When you say managed, just to follow up, are you thinking managed by a multilateral institution or managed on more of a bilateral basis? Or what are you talking about here?
Usually when I think of managed, multilateral. Exactly. Or some type of regional body that has oversight.
So we have, on that question of competition, a great question from our virtual listeners. Do you see any hope for the United States and China to work together to solve global issues in the Pacific, such as climate change, despite their competition and differences on many other issues in the Pacific?
I would say categorically yes. Because now that we've gone beyond the point of Chinese competition in the region, China is going to be in the region for an awful long time. We have to think in terms of what are the partnerships that we can build upon. We can't have a relationship with China that's based on one day we may go kinetic. All right. So there are areas of cooperation. I think one of the, I would say, inequities or imbalances between Chinese assistance to the region and American and its allies' assistance is that we tend to focus on capacity building. The Chinese tend to give you what you want. All right. I remember when in Fiji, I mentioned to the Chinese ambassador that, well, you know, the coup is still active. All right. We don't have a democratic government. We would prefer you not to supply Fiji's military with additional weapons. The Chinese ambassador says, sure, great, but I'm going to give them trucks. All right. And we're going to help them build a new road on the northern part of the island. That's the type of activity that the Chinese can do well and can do quickly. We tend to take time. All right. Part of that taking time is not necessarily a lack of desire, but we have executive branch, we have the legislative branch, we have to have authorizations and appropriations, and it goes on and on. Whereas the Chinese ambassador can pick up the phone, call Beijing, and someone will say, oh, we will use this front company for the PLA to go build a road in Fiji, and it happens in 30 days. If you want a new clinic, ask the Chinese ambassador. I'll say this, when in the Pacific, I would sometimes visit a school, and there was not enough in my budget. I would have to do things like go to Rotary International to ask for book donations, all right, because there was nothing in my budget. So there are ways in which we can identify areas of cooperation. I should probably say this, at one time, there was actually a trilateral agricultural project in Timor-Leste between the Timorese, China, and the United States. We don't talk about that one much, but it did exist. There is potential. So.
Very interesting. Other questions? Yeah, please.
What's your reaction to the Biden cutoff of certain technology to China that was announced in the last 2 weeks?
I think we have to figure out which technology we're talking about cutting off. Well, and we know that Taiwan's the largest maker of semiconductors. Uh, I think we have to be very realistic that we are not going to change the nature of China's role as a global economic power. And at a certain stage, it goes back to the point of cooperation and partnership. We're going to have to move beyond this conflictual relationship with China, all right, to much more. Yes, we're always going to be competitors, but we're going to have to figure out ways to be partners. And I think that looking at ways to antagonize the relationship doesn't work. We saw in the last administration the absolute failure of our economic policies, adding tariffs and sanctions, whatever, against China, was basically a failure, and it was foolhardy. So we have to move beyond that. And I think that there will always be a kerfluffle, I think I'll use that word, in our relationship. But overall.
That's a technical diplomatic term.
Yes.
Yes.
Right.
Interesting. Great. Other questions? Yeah, Hiro, go ahead.
Thank you. I'm Hiro Miyazaki, professor of anthropology here. I used to be a Pacific Island specialist, so I really welcome US's re-engagement with the Pacific. But I'd like to ask you a question about what US is doing and should do in the area of education in the region, particularly higher education in the region. And I think I used to live in Fiji, so I saw Vivi Stella Institution, University of South Pacific, kind of decline over time, largely due to a lack of support and also financial support. But also in the U.S., there used to be several kind of institutions that were devoted to Pacific Island expertise, but those institutions also have declined. And what do you think we, as educators, but also policymakers, should do to boost our knowledge of the Pacific? Pacific has a rich history and rich cultures, and traditions, and our engagement should be with the Pacific Island nations should be culturally sensitive and informed. So
It's a very good question. And I think one of the best parts about being a retired, I don't have to speak on behalf of the United States. I always say that the benefit of becoming an ambassador is that you can finally use the first person. Right?
That's great.
So I believe that the United States has continually failed when it had opportunities in the Pacific. For example, we're a charter member of the Pacific Community, which is known also as the Secretary of the Pacific Community. And we only give 17% of the budget and to the Pacific Community. And that's where all the crop agencies are managed out of. And one of the most important crop agency is the University of the South Pacific. The United States underfunds USP. All right, it is probably, well, not probably, it is the premier educational facility in the region. Outside of, you can go to University of Auckland, you can go to other places, but in the Pacific, it's USP. And we have continually underfunded USP, and underfunded in a way that we have not yet identified what are those areas in which, again, college-educated Pacific Islanders want to focus on. They want to focus on being members of the global economy. You don't necessarily have to live in Chicago to be a member of the global economy. You could actually do that from Suva. They want to be involved in climate change resiliency, as an example. They want to be part of the solutions, not of the problems. And by continually to underfund the University of South Pacific, we have failed. And that failure is exacerbated again by the Chinese ability to fill a vacuum whenever we create one. Fortunately, they have not been able to overextend themselves into USP, but I do think that is a key area in which we could quickly, I think, apply more resources as part of our commitment to a long-term solution in partnership with Pacific Island countries. It's right there at the University of the South Pacific.
And maybe there's something we as universities can do in partnership with the U.S. government.
Well, there you go.
help with that, so.
I just kind of threw that out there.
Absolutely. A question from an online viewer. Could you expand a bit on specific actions that Pacific Island nations are hoping that the U.S. will take to help address climate change in the Pacific and the increased rate of natural disasters? What are they asking for from the U.S.?
I think this is where it gets to be very, very difficult because, as we well know, Pacific Island countries have no carbon footprint, none whatsoever. So what they're actually asking for, since they're the victims of the carbon producing countries, is we want more economic and development assistance as compensation for sea level rise. I mean, it's very, very simple what's going on. I've always felt that pinning too much on climate change for economic development reasons may take you in the wrong direction. So, but the types of issues that are important to them, we can identify, and we don't have to make it part necessarily of climate change. We'll give you an example. We spend a lot of money trying to make climate resilient or hurricane resilient housing in the Pacific. Well, Pacific Islanders build houses that fall down, and they do that for a reason, all right? Because the cyclone comes and knocks them down, all right? So why do we, why would we give millions of dollars to an American NGO to build housing in the Pacific when Pacific Islanders may not actually want housing, but they may want and need better water and waste management systems, okay? So I think we have to, be much more clear about our engagement and just don't deal with climate change as some existential threat and oh my God, these islands are going to disappear. But they're really not going to disappear. And what's really at stake is the fact that we've overlooked them, we've under-resourced them, and as a result of our actions, we have created a strategic and security vacuum in the region that only we can fill.
Interesting. There was another question. Yeah, please, go ahead.
Hi, Bradford McGann, Northwestern Law School. In conversations like these, it's easy to focus on the threats, the existential threats facing the region, the national security threats, and have this conversation lens of risk. But having spent a third of your career in the region, having lived and worked alongside the people of the South Pacific, what have you seen or do you currently see that gives you hope that we can overcome some of these threats and achieve this progress that we've been discussing during this conversation?
Great question.
It is a great question. And I think for the sake of transparency, I should note that's my son. Right. And it wasn't a planted question. I think the one thing that I've actually learned being in the region is that the people of the Pacific actually are inclined to want to be with us, to work with the United States. I think the attributes of the people of the region there, we mentioned their resiliency, their culture, their approach to life is very, very important. From what I've seen, though, over having spent a third of my career in the region writ large, is that, again, we have taken them for granted, all right? And whenever we take any peoples for granted, that becomes a major strategic shortcoming on our part. And so we need to look at the Pacific not as a place where we have to give more assistance, but a place of opportunity. for growth, for well-managed and regulated mining, for example, that is advantageous to the peoples of the region and not exploitative. How to build multilateral structures and bilateral relationships in a way that are beneficial not only to the United States, but beneficial to the people of the region and our other partners. And understanding also that we're not alone. It's not just having partnerships with China, but with Japan, Australia, New Zealand, France. The UK is now coming back and opening up more embassies. So looking at ways in which we can sit down at the table with Pacific peoples and help them determine what's best for their future in a way in which we're targeting our own resources and assistance in the best way.
Maybe a follow-up on that. Do you think that we, whoever that we is, we the US government, we Americans, have anything to learn from people in the Pacific?
Patience is the first thing that we have to learn. I think as Americans, we always look for the quick fix. Going back, we think we have a summit at the White House, and that solves it, all right? As opposed to thinking about what is our real long-term engagement. We're happy that we can announce $810 million in assistance to the region. Well, that's not really much. I mean, you want to amortize that over 10 years, right? So I do think that we have to focus on what is our long-term relationship, what does that engagement really mean, and also what does it mean to people who are, by their very nature, more friendly to us than not. And I will say in terms of that friendliness and the culture of the people, one of the best experiences we had as a family in the Pacific was that our youngest son is autistic, and his experience in Fiji was terrific. People, again, I talk about patient, they were loving, they were caring. You know, he has verbal issues, so they would ask a question, then wait for him to answer. As opposed to an American, well,
Hurry up.
yeah, hurry up, right? So again, I think what I'm saying, that kind of patient, that long view approach that Pacific peoples have, is probably something that we can learn from.
Yes, please, Nadia.
Hello, this is Nadia, a visitor scholar to Buffett. I'm not sure that my question would be related to this conversation, but I would like to ask, and I want to know, as did you work as ambassador, United States ambassadors to these specific islands? So I want to know your opinion in regards to the immigrants from the South Asia, from Middle East countries, that they are stuck for years in these islands, specifically to Fiji and Papua New Guinea. That what is your opinion in this regards, that their rights are violated from this the administrators of these islands, and they are treated as detainees or prisoners to these islands, and these immigrants are just, they are seeking the asylum from the Australian government. I want to know that what action that United States has done to these immigrants in these past years. Thanks.
Nauru.
Not only do I not speak on behalf of the United States government, I also don't speak on behalf of the Australian government. But I do think, if you recall, at the end of the Obama administration, there was some discussion about taking some of the people who were on Nauru or on Manus Island in Papua New Guinea and bringing them to the United States. And we wanted to do that in partnership with Australia. The successive administration, the Trump administration, stopped that. All right, that never occurred. I do think that when we look at the question of refugees, which is something that's actually very important to me in my retired career, that we have to look at refugee and vulnerable populations in a particular way, and that we can't forget that the sort of the 3 R's, it's relief, repatriation, and resettlement. If you can't repatriate, then you have to resettle. And you have to resettle folks in a place that's advantageous to them. I do think that the Australian government has learned that the situation in Nauru is, I'd say, far from a success. We do know that one of the issues regarding the United States building a new naval facility on Manus Island in Papua New Guinea is also hampered by the fact there are still large numbers of refugees from South Asia in Papua New Guinea. So these issues are going to have to be dealt with. I'm trying not to answer this question in a right or wrong way. I'm trying to be very specific that I do think that how we deal with the question of refugees should be given a greater priority, particularly in dealing with women and other vulnerable populations of refugees. We don't always get it right, but then it's up to us as individuals to make sure that we press to get it right. So.
Thank you. So we have to stop, but I just want to ask you one last question for the sake of the students who may be watching us online. If a student is watching and saying, my goodness, I would love to be Ambassador McGann someday, what career advice do you have for folks who might be thinking about a diplomatic career? Is it a good option? How should they prepare themselves as students? What would you say?
Well, the first thing I would say is I didn't know I was going to become Ambassador McGann. So you don't start out by saying that. All right? But I do think you start out with having an understanding that why do you join government? All right? And government is not an occupation. Government is a service. All right? So you're fundamentally a patriot to decide that this is what you want to do. I mean patriot in the traditional sense of the word. There's nothing wrong with loving your country. All right, right, and not loving your country right or wrong, but trying to make it better. All right, you know, the arc of the universe turns towards justice, and so going into government service is supposed to be changing that arc. So I would say that if you want to join government, it's a good thing. If you want to join the foreign service, it's probably even better because there is no better career I can think of representing your country, representing the peoples of the United States. We as a people have so much to give, so much to offer. We don't always get it right, but we usually do. And that in itself is one reason to join the Foreign Service.
Wonderful, thank you. Well, Ambassador, thank you so much for your time today and for all that you've shared with us. You really enlightened us a great deal, so thank you.